All right, students. So this is the next chapter in our discussion about influenza virus, and we're going to talk about evolution and how does evolution relate to influenza. Well, first of all, what is evolution? When we look at life on the planet, we've been able to recognize that the organization of life provides evidence of change over time. And one of the main ways that I like to kind of illustrate this is to look at, sorry, is to look at fish first. Fish are the first organisms to have a backbone or to be vertebrates. And if we look at fish, they are the most primitive of what we would call the vertebrates. And if you look at fish and then the next organisms, we would see amphibians. And so amphibians would be a little more adapted than fish, so they're a little more adapted. And some of the things that they have that make them adapted is they can spend some time on land. Some of them live primarily on land. They have primitive lungs to breathe atmospheric oxygen. But some of the things that kind of keep them as a primitive organism is they're still tied to water. They have to lay their eggs in water. Their eggs are not naked eggs, but they don't have a covering, so they would dry out. Their lungs aren't really that well developed, and so they still, exchange gas across their skin. And so they have some adaptations, but they don't have a lot. They don't have enough to make them completely land-dwelling, which is why they're amphibians, which means two lives, land and water. And then the next group of organisms are the reptiles. And what we see in reptiles is that they can stay on land, and so they have the adaptation from amphibians. Their lungs are much better. They can breathe air. They don't need thin skin to exchange oxygen, and they have a shelled egg, which makes them very, very successful. And then, of course, you have birds and mammals coming from the reptiles, and birds and mammals have even more success and, larger brains. They are adapted even more. And so what we see is this kind of movement from, early organism to more adapted organism. And we have, a lot of evidence for, how these things came about. We have fossil evidence, embryological evidence that we'll discuss, and we'll see that. And, it hasn't really been a question of, it is evolution happening, but there was a problem with what is the mechanism for how it happens. All right, I got to try to get this thing to slide across. Well, there we go. All right, sorry about that. So how does evolution relate to biology? If we look at, the history of Earth, we can see, things happening along the way. Prokaryotes were first, very simple organisms, and then you had photosynthetic organisms, which have adaptations. And this is a really long period of time. And then you had free oxygen in the atmosphere, which was an important thing because oxygen helps us to process energy. Then you have the oldest eukaryotic fossils, and then multicellular fossils. And if you look at this formation, if you look at this history of Earth as a 24-hour day, the first appearances of Homo sapiens is 30 minutes or 30 seconds ago, which is not a very long period of time. So there has been a really long time on the planet for these evolutionary processes to occur. Well, does evolution relate to the influenza viruses? Well, yes. Evolution relates to a lot of things. Human flu viruses originate in animal hosts such as, pigs and birds, and these things can get combined, and they can exchange genetic material, and then they form these new forms that can be transmitted to humans, causing flu outbreaks. So how does evolution happen? Well, the mechanism for which evolution happens is called natural selection. And this idea of natural selection was provided by both Charles Darwin and this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. And Darwin kind of beat Wallace to the punch, which is why you hear about him more often. But both of these scientists came to the same conclusion in different places. Well, some of the things that we need, some of the scientists that provided some evidence and some contributions to Darwin's idea of natural selection was Cuvier. He looked at the fossil record, and he noticed it showed a succession of different forms of life over time. So let's look at that real quick. So if this is, the top of the rocks here, so you're standing up here, and if we dig down, this way, this is the newer rocks, and these are older rocks. And if you dig down far enough into really, really old rocks, you'll find fossilized fish. And then as you move up, you'll find fish and amphibians. And if you move up again, you'll find fish, I'm going to abbreviate amphibians, and you'll find reptiles. And then if you move up, you'll find fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And one of the things that Cuvier believed was that the difference between these layers was that there was some catastrophic event that caused these changes. Well, Erasmus Darwin was this naturalist and philosopher who proposed that evidence from animal development and animal breeding suggested that species may evolve over time. Dogs come from wolves through selective breeding, and you can see a lot of change there. Lamarck, who believed that complex life forms are descended from simpler forms, he did propose an idea that individuals could acquire characteristics that enable them to evolve over time, and he called this inheritance of acquired traits, which is not true. You cannot pass on an acquired trait. Like if I went to the gym and started working out and got big muscles, it doesn't mean that my kids born after would have bigger muscles. And then this guy named Lyell, he proposed that the Earth's surface is dynamic and explained how different fossil layers were formed, like that up there. And then Malthus, who was just an economist, he said that populations like humans increase at rates faster than their food supply and can thus creating competition, and some humans would starve. And what it did was it gave Darwin the idea, or it provided him evidence that, sometimes species in an area will have too many individuals, and some of them will outcompete the weaker ones. And that's where, we hear this, natural selection, survival of the fittest, survival of the more adapted organisms. Well, Darwin kind of had his eureka moment when he looked at these finches and tortoises of the Galapagos Island, and he noticed that, some of these birds had these really deep beaks, and so like this is a pretty deep beak, and these things eat, hard seeds. This is a bird with kind of a shorter beak depth, and these eat smaller seeds. And where you find these birds with deep beaks, you typically find them on islands with hard seeds, and if you find smaller beaks, you find them on islands with smaller seeds. Well, what is natural selection? Well, the first thing you need to know is that individuals vary in their traits. All individuals of a population are kind of different, not just physical characteristics like beak shape, but also physiology, behavior. Those things vary too. Individuals struggle to exist. Populations often produce more offspring than can survive, and it creates competition for resources. And if these organisms have variations in their traits and there is competition, it means that some are better than others. Well, that's where this comes in. They differ in their fitness. And if you're better at gathering resources, you're probably better at reproducing. And if you reproduce more often, you'll pass on these traits that you have that are variable, and your offspring will have them. And so therefore, if you give it a few generations, these traits that are good will be passed on more and more often, and therefore the population will look a little bit different. Well, Darwin proposed that natural selection allows populations to adapt to a new environment and is the basis of the process of evolution. So originally, giraffe neck kind of varied. We may have had short ones, kind of long ones, medium ones. But as you had more and more giraffes, these trees have leaves further up on the tree, and so long necks are preferred so that you can get to the resource. Well, biologists have identified 3 different ways that natural selection can influence the variation for a trait in a population, and these are the 3 ways, but I want to look at this chart here. Well, this is the variation. So this is how many individuals you have from 0 to, however many, 1,000, 100, whatever. This is some variation. So let's just say that these are mice, and these mice have light color and dark coloration. And there's everything in between. So you'd have, medium here. And it's the same for every graph. So you'd have light and dark there. Well, in stabilizing selection, what we would see is that the light forms and the dark forms are selected against, right? It's not good to be light or dark, but it's good to be kind of in the middle. And so therefore what we would see is the peak would narrow and you would get rid of these kind of outliers. Directional selection means that in this case, what we would see is that dark forms are being selected for and the light ones are being selected against. And so therefore the population moves in a direction. This one is less common, this disruptive selection, where the average is being selected against. Why does genetic material change? And this is kind of the heart of natural selection, because, the variations that we see, like being light colored or dark colored, all comes down to, to genetics. Well, if there's a light colored mouse, his genes say that he's light colored. And if you're a dark colored mouse, your genes say that you're dark colored. Well, how does that work? How does the genetic material change where we had a light version and a dark version? Well, in a cell, how information flows is you have DNA, which is the set of instructions. DNA gets copied into this thing called RNA so that we can read it, and then RNA makes a protein. And we discussed this in a previous chapter. Well, mutations can happen, and we discussed this in the sickle cell anemia. So a change in the nucleotide sequence of a DNA molecule can change the sequence of amino acids and therefore the properties of that protein, so you can make normal hemoglobin or sickle cell hemoglobin. You can make light-colored fur in mice. You can make dark-colored fur in mice. What is some evidence of evolution? Well, we know from the fossil record to genetic evidence, we continue to test, evaluate, and refine our understanding of how evolution happens. So fossils are the mineralized remains or traces of footprints, burrows, skeletons of once living species. We can look at comparative anatomy. If you look at the forelimb of mammals, we all have this humerus. We all have a radius and ulna, and we all have these phalanges. And these are called homologous structures because they're structures that are similar because we're related. There are analogous structures, though, like the wings of birds and bats and insects. They're all wings, and they all look similar, but it's not because they're related. It's because they have the same function. Embryonic development, if you look at a chicken and a human, we see a lot of similarities. But as these things begin to grow and develop, this is when we begin to see changes. But early on, what you see are these homologous structures. We see evidence from genetic material too, like number of amino acid differences compared to human cytochrome C, which is a type of, it's a gene that we have. And if we have 0% difference in humans, and if you look at primates like monkeys, we have very little change. Pigs, we have more change than ducks, turtles, fish, moth. And remember when we talked about fish amphibians, reptiles. Here we see fish. I don't know why they didn't put amphibians in here, but turtles, reptiles, birds, and then mammals. Why has the influenza virus evolved? Well, every year about 3 to 5 million people are infected, resulting in about 500,000 deaths. And one of the worst cases of flu was in 1918. A variant of the flu virus is called the Spanish flu, infected about 500 million people, and it killed about a third of the world's population at that time, which was devastating. Well, there are two basic methods by which the flu can change, and it's through antigenic shift and antigenic drift. Antigenic drift occurs when there are small changes in the surface spikes of the flu. So these little spikes on the surface can change a little bit. Antigenic shift has greater consequences because it provides two different forms of the virus that infect the same cell. And that is it for this chapter.